And now to housing matters. Housing constitutes an important aspect of the society's well-being, touching significantly at the core of their social and economic lives. Housing is not only a reflection of the economic status of the household, but it is also an important economic activity that can create a significant proportion of the GDP. Housing deficit resulting from the inability of the supply of decent housing stock to meet the society's need can be expected to rise with poverty, population growth, and urbanization, that is rural-urban migration. The just concluded maiden edition of the Kaduna International Housing Exhibition with the theme Kaduna Sustainable Housing Development, a model for northern housing reforms, underscores the importance of sustainable development in addressing the housing challenges in Kaduna State and the country as a whole. Newsday correspondent tells us more in this report.
In Nigeria, the housing deficit has been growing. For instance, the National Rolling Plan of 1990 to 1992 estimated the housing deficit at 4.8 million, requiring an annual increase of 700,000 units to bridge the deficit. By the year 2014, the deficit had risen to 16 to 18 million units. In 2019, the deficit rose to about 17 to 20 million units, requiring an annual increase of 2 million units for 10 years to close the deficit. Also, the National Integrated Infrastructure Master Plan estimated that 1 million units have to be added to the housing stock annually between 2014 and 2043 to estimate the housing deficit in Nigeria. The 1 million standardized affordable housing units per year has been the enduring target of recent government policies on housing since the first National Implementation Plan 2010 to 2013 of the Nigeria Vision 2020 as a means of eliminating the housing deficit. In all societies that have succeeded in providing their housing requirements, governments have played the leading role through planning and direct provision of social and affordable housing. From the economic perspective, housing is an important contributor and potential driver of economic and financial development. The large housing deficit provides an opportunity for stimulating economic growth using the housing sector, while the existence of large housing deficits indicates the failure of the market to deliver the housing requirements in the urban areas. The rising deficit also indicates the failure of previous policies to deliver the housing requirements. The government has evidently recognized the need to prioritize housing delivery, both as economic and social issue. The over-reliance on the markets in the context of high poverty rates may not be effective means of closing the deficit. Baraka Salis Abdullahi, KSMC.
Thank you, Baraka, for that report. Now, with us in the studio to discuss more on this is the Director of Events at the just concluded Kaduna State International Housing Exhibition, Mr. Joshua James. Thank you for coming into the program Newsday.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure and privilege to be here.
All right, you have watched and listened to the report as presented by a correspondent. What is your take?
Well, first and foremost, let me commend the report. It covered holistically what the last exhibition stood for. That's the Kaduna International Housing Exhibition. In the first place, why did we come up with the exhibition? And how is it related to the housing deficits that we have in the country? To start with, at the moment, we do not have, a data for housing deficit in Kaduna State. The last time, I was privileged to meet with the permanent secretary of the Kaduna State Ministry for Housing and Urban Development. Is that the Bureau of Statistics is working around that to get that data readily available. But we know that at the national level, there is a huge, housing deficit, and it has been increasing year by year. In 1991, it stood at 7 million housing deficit in Nigeria. It grew up to 12 million in 2007. In 2023, it grew up to 28 million housing deficit in Nigeria. Well, some real estate developers put it at well over 50 million housing deficit in Nigeria. But of course, that all depends on the indices for data collection. But give and take, we have, a very, very important problem that we should be talking about, and that is there is housing deficits, well over 25 million, in Nigeria. And so what we decided to do was, one, to look at what are some of the causes for housing deficit in Nigeria. And like the minister who attended the event and was a guest speaker, that one of the fundamental reasons that we have the housing deficit in Nigeria is the fact that too many Nigerians are poor to get mortgage for housing. In fact, he said the statistics shows that about 43% of Nigerian families, when you put their purchasing power together, is at 1.1 million. That tells you it's very difficult for them to get, housing, mortgage for housing. Two, government cannot do it alone, and so there is also a need to bring in private developers into the scheme of things, and that was what we looked at, because FAC allocation is shrinking by the day. The amount of money that state government gets from the federal is shrinking day by the day. There is huge debt. You have few money chasing after too many important things at the state level. And so what we decided to do was, okay, how do we bring all stakeholders to come together to look at some of these reasons? Why is there housing deficit? What can we do? And of course, the Kaduna State Development and Property Company, the MD and CEO, Abubakar was the convener of the event in collaboration with the Kaduna State Ministry for Housing and Urban Development. And then we had a partner led by the MD, Mr. Rotimi Shidumu, who have been organizing the exhibition in Southwest to look at, okay, how do we bring everyone together? Developers on one side, policymakers from the National Assembly on one side, how do we bring the state government on one side, how do we bring the off-takers, they call them, that is the people who need these houses, and then look at the problem. Why are we having housing deficit? Is it that too many people cannot acquire mortgage for housing? Is it that the current situation of cement and mortar, the conventional building pattern is becoming more expensive? So should we start looking at alternative building material, new technologies, and smart solution for building? So we look at all of this and say, okay, let's bring everyone together, let's brainstorm. We looked at land administration. Of course, we know that the Land Use Act of 1779 that has energized land to have that economic power. But at the backside of it is the fact that a lot of problems associated with the Land Use Act, and talking about the general land administration right now, too many Nigerians cannot acquire land. So all of these problems made us to say, okay, let's come together and then talk about an exhibition, and we brought everyone together to look at how can we begin to find solution to the housing deficit in Kaduna State.
All right, Kaduna State Deputy Governor Dr. Adia Sabwa Balarabe, who represented Governor Obasani at the opening of the Kaduna International Housing Exhibition, speaks.
We're gathered here to focus attention on a critical sector that is so fundamental to the preservation of human dignity. Access to safe, affordable, and secure housing is the foundation of human dignity. You cannot enjoy other rights unless you have a roof over your head. In Nigeria and indeed across the globe, homelessness is a major concern. Fashioning effective strategies to address housing deficits has therefore become an urgent and strategic imperative. The federal and state government have been working relentlessly to address these housing deficits. Our dear President, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, GCFR, has made provision of affordable houses for Nigerian citizens one of his topmost priorities. The Federal Ministry of Housing and Urban Development has been working assiduously to realize Mr. President's vision for the housing sector. I recently held a strategic engagement meeting with the MD CEO of the Federal Housing Authority, Honorable Maiden, and his top management team. Our discussions centered on forging a partnership to provide mass housing for our people. We have allocated a suitable parcel of land to FHA and would be meeting with their team to work out modalities for the implementation of this housing project. Provision of affordable houses for Kaduna State citizens is a key priority of our administration. We are committed to addressing the housing deficit in Kaduna State in line with our administration's policy thrust and President Bola Tinubu's renewed hope agenda. We have adopted a holistic approach towards filling the identified gap. The approaches are as follows. We're partnering with local and international investors. We have been partnering with local and international investors to frontally address our housing deficit.
That was Dr. Hadiza Sabo Abalarabi, Kaduna State Deputy Governor, speaking during the opening of the Kaduna International Housing Exhibition. Now, coming back to you, talking about the decisions taken by the government, which are masses-centered, and of course, taking into cognizance the economic situation of the country and the state. How affordable are these houses to the low-income earners?
Okay, so let me talk first and foremost on the fact that housing is a priority, and that was what the Deputy Governor represented. The Governor said there, it's fundamental. It's a constitutional right for every Nigerian to live adequately, to have a home, to have a shelter, over his head. I mean, it protects and the dignity of the human life itself. Now, that being said, one of the key areas we looked at during the exhibition is we have social housing, we have mass housing, and of course we have looking at the commercial aspect of it. But the focus was on social housing and mass housing. Now the question you ask, how affordable is social housing or mass housing? Now, I don't want to talk about the the Qatari housing scheme that the Governor, His Excellency of Kaduna State is embarking on. I mean, that is free. But we're looking at what are some of the other alternatives to make housing affordable for Nigerians. One, we need more Nigerians to be able to access mortgage for housing. So it's a contribution. One area we looked at, as a civil servant, there is a contribution for housing, and that fund have not been effectively utilized. So we're looking at how can that be effectively utilized so that we have more Nigerians access mortgage for housing. That is on one side. Now on the other side is looking at, let's look for alternative building technology, affordable, cheaper than the conventional cement and mortar. Okay, now having said that, there are also other aspects that we should be looking at. For example, rent to own. If I have a house or if I rent a house, should we start be looking at legislation to make it possible that after 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years of renting a house, I should be able to acquire that house for myself. So these are what we are looking at. If you are talking about the conventional cement and mortar, very expensive. Now another aspect, of course, is access to land itself. We know how difficult it is to access land, how expensive it is to access land, and that is why we brought the policymakers from the National Assembly as well as the executive arm of government to begin to look at those areas. Now, I think Kaduna State is doing something very smart and very intelligent, and we must give it to the Kaduna State government at this point in time, and that is the land swap deal. So developers coming, they are given lands to develop housing. In turn, these developers are not paid money, but rather they are given lands equivalent to that amount of money that they should be paid, and it makes it easier. So we want to look at these 4 fundamental areas to make housing affordable for Nigerians. The first is access. There should be easy access to land ownership in Nigeria. We must begin to review our laws. Second, alternative to building other than the conventional cement and mortar. The event, we saw a lot of Nigerians who have been able to devise new technologies for building. And some of these things are peculiar to us in northern Nigeria. And that is why the event focused on building reforms for northern Nigeria, because of the epicenter Kaduna serve in northern Nigeria. The third aspect, we should also look at assets to mortgage by Nigerians. Not just the civil servant, but Nigerians. How much, can I contribute before I'm able to access that particular, mortgage? And the fourth area that we should also look at is government intervention in solving the housing deficits. Of course, like I said at the onset, government cannot do it alone. So there is a need for the private, sector of the economy to come into housing and see how we can partner to get it right. These are the four fundamental, problems that were identified at the exhibition. And if we begin to get it right, then we are close to solving the housing deficit in Nigeria.
All right, Mr. Joshua James, before I let you go, earlier you mentioned that the Qatari house project is free. What do you mean by that?
Well, like I said, at that point in time, that I represent KSMC, okay, Kaduna State Development and Property Company. That is what our projects. Okay, part of our project is we have 2,000 housing units to develop, within the next 5 years. It's a tall dream, but we can achieve that. But the Qatari housing scheme is a direct intervention, from what I learned, is a direct housing deficit intervention from the office of His Excellency the Governor, of Kaduna State. I think the first phase of 100 housing units is almost ready. And what we got is that the governor said these houses will be given to citizens of Kaduna State free. I mean, that is an intervention. But like I said, the government does not have all it takes to continue to provide this intervention every time. So there is a need for us to think outside the box, to look at how do we solve this housing deficit problem that we have at the moment. Whether you put it at 28 million, you put it at 50 million, there is a housing deficit, and that has been identified. And by the time the Bureau of Statistics in Kaduna State here is done with, done with the data collection, they're working now as promised by the Permanent Secretary of the Kaduna State Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, Dr. Halilu Musa. We get to know what is our own fair share of the percentage of housing deficit in Nigeria, and then we begin to think about how do we look at it. The event, the Kaduna International Housing Exhibition, is bringing the private sector into it, and that is one key thing that we are doing at the maiden edition. We're looking at a 2.0, a 3.0, a 4.0, and for each of these housing exhibitions we hold, one thing is focus. We had a housing exhibition last year. How much in terms of solution has it provided for housing deficits? And then we look at the new one. So that is what we want to do, in subsequent editions of the housing exhibition. And we hope that if we get it right, we should be able to take percentage by percentage of citizens of Kaduna State, away from the housing deficit. All right,
Mr. Joshua James, thank you for coming in to share your experiences in the program Newsday on KSMC.
It's a privilege to be here, and just before I go, permit me to say it's like coming back home, because I actually started my career as a media professional with Capital TV those days, where I anchored the sport program. So it's like coming home to see some of my friends I've not seen for a long time. Thank you very much.
That was the director of event at the just concluded Kaduna State International Housing Exhibition, Mr. Joshua James, speaking on how to tackle housing deficit in Kaduna State and, of course, in Nigeria.